I was grabbing coffee with an old colleague recently, Elena. She spent most of the hour venting about her difficult sister who had moved into her guest room after a medical crisis. Elena looked exhausted, and frankly, everyone at the table was treating her like a martyr. She talked about the emotional labor of hosting someone and the boundaries she'd had to enforce to protect her own peace. She spoke in the polished language of modern therapy, all about regulation, self-care, and safe spaces. The room nodded in sympathy, but then Elena mentioned a specific boundary. She had banned her sister from using the kitchen or moving around the house after 9 p.m. because Elena needed the environment to be still to manage her own anxiety. She said it with a shrug, as if she were simply choosing a paint color. She didn't mention that her sister suffers from a severe autonomic disorder where missing a late-night electrolyte dose or a specific meal window triggers tachycardia and fainting spells. To Elena, her need for a quiet hallway was a psychological emergency. Her sister's potential heart failure was just a lack of cooperation. What was most striking wasn't just Elena's coldness, but the way she used the word care to justify it. She genuinely believed that by providing a roof, she had purchased the right to ignore the biological reality of the person under it. When I asked if her sister was getting better, Elena sighed and said, "She just won't do the work to stabilize. I'm doing my best, but she's choosing to stay stuck." Elena shift. That shift from the performance of a savior to the quiet enforcement of a physical danger zone is more common than we want to admit. We live in a world where the person who pays the bills is automatically granted the moral high ground, allowing them to frame their minor discomfort as a crisis while treating another person's medical survival as a mere preference. It's a silent, socially sanctioned form of harm that happens behind closed doors every day, and it's protected by a narrative we've all agreed not to question.
Wow. That story it's just the perfect crystallization of the entire crisis we're here to discuss today.
It really is.
It sounds, on the surface, like a simple roommate dispute,
Yeah.
Or just friction between siblings. But if you actually look at the mechanics of what Elena is doing, you're seeing a complete and total collapse of the ethical framework that used to hold families and, frankly, society together.
It felt like a collapse. I mean, sitting there watching everyone just nod along, I felt like I was the only one seeing the invisible violence in that statement.
Yes.
Elena wasn't just being mean or selfish. She was using a very specific, very modern logic to make her cruelty sound like virtue. And that's really what we need to take apart today.
Absolutely.
We've got a massive stack of research in front of us, sociological papers on the economics of care, philosophical treatises on, the nature of truth itself, and some really deep psychological critiques of modern narcissism.
And we're going to connect dots that I think usually don't get connected. We have to understand how we moved from a society where duty or responsibility was seen as the highest good to one where comfort or maybe personal peace is the highest good. Right? We have to look at the philosophy, the psychology, and the economics that allow someone like Elena to sleep soundly at night while her sister is literally at risk of fainting in the next room.
Philosophy. Because for me, the most baffling part of that coffee date was that Elena didn't think she was the villain. She wasn't acting guilty. She truly believed she was the victim. She felt that she was under attack by her sister's illness.
This is what we're calling the philosophical inversion. I mean, if we look at the history of Western thought, or really just basic human survival, there has always been a clear hierarchy of needs. Exactly, but even more basic than that. Biological survival is the basement. It's the absolute foundation of the house. Air, blood pressure, heart rate, hydration, nutrition. If those things fail, you die. Full stop. Psychological comfort, feeling calm, feeling focused, not being annoyed by your sister walking down the hall, that's the first floor. It's important, but you cannot build the first floor if the basement is flooded. The structure collapses.
Right. You don't scream at a paramedic for tracking mud on your nice white carpet while they're doing CPR on your spouse.
You don't.
The mud, the annoyance, the discomfort is completely irrelevant compared to the objective biological reality of death.
Exactly. But now look at Elena's equation. She has completely flattened that hierarchy. In fact, you could argue she's inverted it.
She absolutely has.
To her, the psychological emergency of hearing footsteps after 9 p.m., which she claims triggers her anxiety, that is weighed equally against her, maybe even higher than the physical emergency of her sister's potential tachycardia.
Her feeling of distress has become just as real, just as urgent as her sister's objective biological failure.
It's become more real in her mind. And this is where the language becomes so important.
The language she used was so polished. She kept using the word regulation. She said, "I need to regulate my nervous system." It sounded so scientific. Like, she was discussing a legitimate medical condition of her own.
And that is a deliberate or maybe subconscious co-option of language that creates a dangerous false equivalence here.
Okay.
Regulation, in a true medical sense, the kind of regulation the sister needs, is autonomic. It is involuntary. Your autonomic nervous system controls your heart rate, your digestion, your blood pressure. You cannot mindset your way out of a drop in blood volume.
You can't meditate your way to higher blood pressure.
No. If you have dysautonomia, you need salt, you need fluid, you need specific medications at specific times. That is objective reality. It's physics and biology.
But Elena is using regulation to mean, I want to feel calm.
Elena's talking about emotional regulation. And that is a completely different category. That is the internal psychological work of managing your own reaction to the world around you. And here is the dark brilliance of her maneuver.
What's that?
By using the same word, regulation, she equates her emotional work with her sister's biological function. But emotional regulation is, historically and developmentally, an adult responsibility. It's the work you do inside your own head. I hear a noise, it startles me, but I am safe. I can calm myself down.
But she isn't doing that work. She's outsourcing it. She's making her sister do it by not existing after 9 p.m.
This is the core mechanism of control. The person with the power, the one paying the bills, the one who owns the house, externalizes their internal responsibility. Elena refuses to do the hard work of self-soothing.
Right.
Instead, she controls the external environment.
Right.
She forces the vulnerable person to shrink, to stop moving, to stop eating, to stop existing, so that she doesn't have to feel annoyed or anxious.
That's the payer as authority doctrine you mentioned in the outline. Because it's her house, she gets to define what reality is. The rules of physics don't apply, only the rules of her comfort.
And this leads us to the deeper philosophical rot. The research we're looking at here draws a direct line between this kind of behavior and what's described as the ideological solvent of postmodernism and certain aspects of woke ideology.
Now, just to be clear for everyone listening, we're not talking about voting patterns or specific political parties here.
We're talking about epistemology. We're talking about how we as a culture know what is true.
The source material describes these ideologies as an acidic solvent to objective reality. That's a very strong image. How does that possibly apply to a dispute between two sisters in a guest room?
Well, think about what the Enlightenment Project gave us, for better or worse. It gave us a fundamental commitment to empirical reality. A heart rate of 160 beats per minute is a fact. It exists outside of my opinion of it.
It's true whether I like it or not.
It's true whether you like it, whether it's convenient, whether it makes you feel bad. But certain strains of critical theory in postmodernism argue that truth is not objective. They argue that truth is a social construct, that it's created by power dynamics and lived experience.
Okay, so if my lived experience is that you are harming me by walking to the kitchen for a glass of water,
then in this framework, that is the truth. Your subjective feeling of harm becomes just as valid, if not more valid, than the objective biological need of the other person.
So it's a competition of harms.
It's a competition of harms where the person with the most social power gets to define what counts as harm. If you dissolve the objective standard of harm, if you say biology doesn't matter as much as feeling, then harm becomes whatever the person with the most social leverage feels is harmful.
So if Elena feels anxious, then she is unsafe. Her subjective feeling completely replaces the objective fact of her sister's physical safety.
It's terrifying because it removes the referee. There's no scoreboard anymore. There's no objective reality to appeal to. It's just whoever can scream, "I'm uncomfortable."
The loudest.
Or whoever holds the keys to the house.
Or whoever holds the keys. The source material argues that this ideology inevitably creates honored and dishonored groups. Now, in the macro-political sense, we can see how this plays out in identity politics, but let's look at the micro-totalitarianism of Elena's home.
Micro-totalitarianism.
The honored individual is the one who is regulated, productive, solvent, the one who pays the bills.
Elena.
The dishonored individual is the one who is chaotic, dependent, sick, unproductive. The sister.
And once you were put into that dishonored category, your rights just seem to vanish. Elena didn't seem to think her sister had a fundamental right to access water or electrolytes. Because in this worldview, rights are not inherent to being human. They're conditional. They're granted by the powerful. The ideology rejects the individual as the primary unit of value. If there are no objective standard for human dignity, like, for instance, every human needs to be able to eat when they are hungry, then rights become negotiable.
They depend on the goodwill of the person in power.
Exactly. Elena has defined herself as the honored martyr and her sister as the chaotic drain. Once that classification is locked in, the sister's individual rights, her very right to biological survival, they just evaporate.
And it justifies control without any accountability. If reality is socially constructed, as you said, then the person who controls the narrative
Controls reality.
And Elena controls the narrative at the coffee shop. She uses the right words, she pays the mortgage, therefore she owns the reality inside that house.
Her sister, fainting in the dark, has no voice, no money, and therefore, in this twisted philosophical framework, she effectively has no reality. She becomes a non-person whose needs are secondary to the feelings of the real person in the house.
That's the philosophical inversion. It's a huge piece of the puzzle. But there's a psychological layer here, too, that feels just as important. Elena didn't sound like a tyrant. She didn't sound like a Bond villain.
No.
She sounded like she was in therapy. She used all the right buzzwords: boundaries, self-care, emotional labor.
And this is the therapeutic shield. It's the second pillar of our analysis today. We have to look at how the language of care, healing, and therapy has been co-opted to justify the withdrawal of actual care.
This brings me to another story from our research stack. This one wasn't a conversation I overheard. It was a thread on a very popular online forum for young professionals. A person, we'll call them Alex, posted about setting a boundary with their disabled sibling.
Okay.
The sibling required repositioning at night to prevent the formation of bed sores.
Which, just to be crystal clear for anyone listening, is a severe medical necessity. Bed sores or pressure ulcers can lead to horrific infections, sepsis, and even death. This is not a comfort issue, it's a tissue viability issue. It's life and death.
Life and death. But Alex wasn't framing it that way at all. Alex framed this request as an infringement on their nocturnal autonomy.
Their what?
Their nocturnal autonomy. They wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is very close, that they needed to protect their energy so they could show up as their best self at their corporate job the next day.
God.
They called the siblings' biological need to be moved a toxic demand.
Nocturnal autonomy.
Right.
It is amazing how we can dress up profound neglect in a tuxedo of therapeutic language.
And the comments, that was the most shocking part. Hundreds of comments, and the vast majority were cheering Alex on. You can't pour from an empty cup. You have to protect your peace. That sounds so draining for you. You're doing the right thing.
And this brings us directly, almost word for word, to Christopher Lasch and his seminal work from 1979, The Culture of Narcissism. He wrote this decades ago, but he predicted Alex and Elena with absolutely frightening accuracy.
Now, when we say narcissism, I think most people immediately think of, a guy looking in a mirror all day, or maybe a grandiose politician with a huge ego. But Lasch meant something much more specific, didn't he?
Yes, much more subtle and more pervasive. Lasch wasn't really talking about simple vanity or big egos. He was talking about a psychological structure he called the minimal self.
Minimal self. Yeah.
He argued that as modern society becomes more bureaucratic, more terrifying, more economically unstable, people lose faith in the future. They lose faith in big institutions, in politics, in religion, in the very idea of building a legacy that will outlive them.
So the world feels too big and scary to change.
It feels unchangeable. So people retreat. They shrink their world down to the only thing they feel they can actually control, their own psychological well-being.
Their inner world.
Their inner world. Lasch calls this survivalism. The primary goal of life shifts from doing good or achieving salvation or building a just society to simply psychic survival. The ultimate goal is just peace of mind.
And in that context, other people, especially needy, sick, or difficult people, they aren't family or community anymore. They're threats.
They are threats to your equilibrium. They are agents of chaos. If your main goal in life is to keep your internal waters perfectly calm and still, then a sister who needs water at 3 a.m. is a rock thrown directly into your pond. She becomes an enemy combatant against your personal peace.
So Alex doesn't see a human being in pain who might die. Alex sees a vampire who is draining their precious energy that they need for their job.
And this is where the therapeutic sensibility, as Lasch called it, comes in. He argued that our entire society has moved from a religious or civic framework for morality to a therapeutic one. In a religious framework, you might ask, is it morally right to ignore my brother's suffering? In a civic framework, you might ask, what's my duty as a citizen or as a family member? But in a therapeutic framework, those questions become obsolete.
You only ask, is this serving me?
You ask, is this healthy for me? Does this align with my personal needs? Is this good for my growth? The language of therapy provides a perfect moral escape hatch.
A get-out-of-jail-free card for responsibility.
If Alex says, I am neglecting my sibling, Alex sounds like a monster. But if Alex says, I am holding a firm boundary to protect my capacity, Alex sounds like a self-actualized, emotionally intelligent, healthy adult.
It's that toxic demand reframing we talked about, a biological necessity, preventing skin from literally rotting off the bone, is linguistically transmuted into a toxic psychological demand on the caregiver.
And Lasch had another concept that applies so perfectly here. He called it the happy hooker success model.
It's a very provocative image. What on earth did he mean by that?
He was contrasting the old American myth, the Horatio Alger story, where you succeed by working hard, having good character, and producing something of tangible value, with the modern happy hooker archetype. The happy hooker doesn't succeed by producing anything. They succeed through impression management, by selling a feeling, by manipulating how others perceive them in order to get what they want.
So Elena and Alex, they're not actually doing the hard work of care. They're managing their image as caregivers.
They are curating an image of virtuous victimhood. They want to be seen as the benevolent host, the caring sibling, the martyr.
Yeah.
But they don't want to do the actual messy, fluid-filled, sleep-deprived, exhausting work of care.
No.
So they use therapeutic language to spin a narrative where they are the hero, not the jailer. They are good people in a bad situation, rather than people making a conscious choice to ignore suffering.
There's one more element from Lasch's work that feels incredibly relevant here. He talks about the narcissistic dread of age and death.
Yes. This, I think, is the emotional root of the psychological aversion. We are a culture that is obsessed with youth, health, vitality, and productivity.
Yeah.
We want to live forever, or at least look like we are on social media.
Yeah.
When a sick, disabled, or dying relative enters our personal space, they are a memento mori.
A reminder of death.
A walking, breathing, coughing reminder that we are all biological organisms that will inevitably fail, that we will get sick, that we will rot, that we will die. The sister's fainting spells, the brother's bed sores, these are intolerable reminders of our own mortality and fragility.
So pushing them into the guest room, demanding silence, setting these so-called boundaries against seeing their pain, it's a way of denying our own eventual death.
We create a still environment, not just to avoid the noise of footsteps, but to avoid the existential noise of mortality. We boundary it away so we can maintain the fantasy that we are immortal, ever-productive machines who will never be dependent ourselves.
Here, I feel like I have to play devil's advocate for a second. Elena is tired. Alex probably is burned out. The cliche, you can't pour from an empty cup, is a cliche for a reason. It's also physically true. If the caregiver collapses, then nobody gets care.
Right. If we stop the analysis here, we're just bashing Elaine and Alex. We're just saying they're bad, selfish, narcissistic people.
Right.
They are individuals operating inside a system that makes genuine care almost impossible. And to understand that, we have to look at the economy.
This brings us to the third story from our research, and this one really focuses on these structural incentives. We have a case study of a family in a very high-cost Western city. They had a grandmother living with them who required a highly specialized and expensive nutritional regimen for a medical condition.
So expensive to buy and time-consuming to prepare.
And the family, after a meeting, decided to stop the diet. They explicitly stated that maintaining this regimen was impeding their household's financial self-actualization.
Financial self-actualization. That is the phrase of the century.
Instead of communal care, they opted for what they called a minimal intervention model. They told the grandmother to just do her best with standard, cheap, processed meals, even though they knew her body couldn't properly process them and it would lead to her decline.
They viewed her physical health not as a family crisis, but as a structural limitation. She was a drag on their career mobility and their ability to save for a vacation.
This is where we have to talk about Baumol's cost disease. It's an economic theory that explains exactly why that family felt they had no other choice and why care in our society is in a state of permanent crisis.
What is the cost disease?
Factory. In 1900, it took hundreds of human hours to build one car. Today, with robotics, with automation, with global supply chains, you can build 1,000 cars with a tiny fraction of the labor. Productivity has skyrocketed.
Right. And when productivity goes up, the cost of the product relative to wages goes down.
That's why we have incredibly cheap TVs, cheap phones, cheap clothes. Technology makes things more efficient.
Exactly. But now, think about care. Think about a nurse gently bathing an elderly patient, or a daughter sitting and patiently feeding a grandmother who has trouble swallowing.
Okay.
It takes the same amount of human time to feed a human today as it did in 1800. You cannot automate empathy. You cannot 3D print compassion. You cannot create a robot that can truly replace the act of listening to someone in pain. There is no productivity gain in the core acts of human care.
So while the rest of the economy gets faster and cheaper and more efficient,
Care stays slow and expensive. It's stuck.
and paradoxically, that means the relative cost of care just explodes. Every hour Elena spends dealing with her sister's medical needs is an hour she isn't at her job, an hour she isn't networking, an hour she isn't upskilling for the modern economy.
In a hyper-capitalist framework, care is structurally an economics of shortage. It is inefficient by its very definition.
So the grandmother in the story, strictly speaking, in cold, hard economic terms, she's a bad investment.
She is a terrible investment. She's a drain on resources with zero future return on investment. And because we have so deeply internalized the logic of the market into our homes and families, we start to treat her like a failing business unit that needs to be cut.
The source also mentions this idea of the no-budget constraint. This seems like a really crucial paradox here.
It's the central tragedy of the modern home. In a business, if a department is inefficient and losing money, what do?
You cut it, you shut it down. That's just rational economics.
Exactly. But in a home, care has a no-budget constraint, meaning it must happen for life to continue. The grandmother must eat something. The sister must receive some kind of medical aid.
You can't just shut down the grandma department.
But the entire economy is screaming at you, punishing you for keeping it open. So the caregiver is trapped in this grinding, impossible tension. They're being pulled by the market to be autonomous, productive, and wealthy, and they're being pulled by the dependent to be inefficient, slow, and caring.
And the market usually wins that tug of war.
The market wins because our survival now depends on it. If Elena loses her job because she's too exhausted from caregiving, then they all lose the house. This brings us to the sociologist Emil Durkheim and his concept of anomie.
Anomie is.
Yeah.
It's a state of normlessness, right?
Yes.
A breakdown of social bonds.
Exactly. Durkheim warned that as society becomes more industrial and transactional, the old social bonds, the extended family, the church, the village community, they dissolve, they wither away, and we're left with nothing but transactional control.
So the grandmother is no longer the matriarch, the spiritual center of the family, the keeper of stories. She's just a structural limitation.
She's a line item on a budget. She's a bill that doesn't pay dividends. We've separated the spheres of life. Industrialization separated home from work. Work is where you produce value. Home is where you consume value.
The home is for Netflix, for Uber Eats, for recharging your battery so you can go back to work and be productive.
Yes. The home is now a spiritual vacuum that is designed for consumption. It is not designed for production. And care is the most fundamental production of all. It is the production of human life itself.
So when the sixth sister introduces work hard, ugly, messy medical work into the consumption zone of the modern home,
She is violating the unspoken contract of the modern household. By being sick and needy, she is breaking the rules.
this leads to that false rescue dynamic the source describes. I found this part really, really insightful.
It's the predictable cycle of failure. A disabled or sick person is offered support. Come live with me, I'll take care of you. Because the caregiver wants to see themselves as a good person.
Right, the savior role.
But the actual conditions for stabilization are then systematically withheld. You can live here, but you can't use the kitchen at night because I need my sleep for my important job. You can live here, but we can't afford that special diet because we're saving for a house.
So they are rescued into a situation where it is literally impossible for them to get better.
Exactly. The necessary accommodation is framed as too expensive or too inconvenient. So the disabled person, predictably, fails to stabilize. They might even get worse. And this provides the perfect confirmation for the caregiver's bias.
See, I told you, she's not trying, she's unhelpable. I gave her a room and she's still sick.
It validates the eventual abandonment. I tried my best to save her, but she just wouldn't do the work.
When in reality, the work required was accommodation, and that was the one thing that was never on the table from the beginning.
It's the empty cup defense again. And we have to hold two thoughts in our heads at the same time. One, the state has retreated, social safety nets are shredded, and families are financially terrified. That is an objective truth. Two, we are using that real terror to justify valuing human life only by the convenience it provides to the able-bodied and the wealthy. We are adopting a cold, calculated market logic and hiding it behind a mask of limited resources.
Here, it's a lot to hold. We've looked at the philosophical inversion, how we basically gaslight reality to prioritize our feelings over objective facts. We've looked at the therapeutic shield, how we use the language of self-care to justify a kind of cultural narcissism. And we've just looked at the economic trap, how the brutal cost of care forces us to view the people we love as financial liability.
It really is a synthesis.
So what happens when you mix postmodernism, narcissism, and late-stage capitalism in a blender?
You get what the research we've been looking at calls conditional humanity.
That feels like the core concept that ties all of this together.
In this system we've built, your humanity is not a right. It's a perk. It's a conditional status. Your fundamental rights are treated as aspirational goals that we'll try to respect if we have the budget and if we have the energy and if you're not too annoying.
So if I like you and I have the energy and you're quiet, you get to have your basic biological needs met.
Exactly. But if I'm tired, or you're annoying me, or the market is down, your rights they evaporate. And the source makes a really powerful point about the history of civil rights here.
Yes, I wanted to touch on that. It argues that we fundamentally misunderstand what rights actually are.
It reminds us that major civil rights movements were not built on sympathy. They weren't built on asking nicely or depending on the kindness and goodwill of the majority.
Right.
They were built on the radical recognition that rights must be upheld precisely when it is inconvenient. You don't get moral credit for respecting someone's rights when they're making you rich and happy. You get credit for respecting their rights when they're inefficient, difficult, and costly.
That is the real test of a civilization, isn't it? Not how we treat the productive winners, but how we treat the difficult dependents.
And right now, we are failing that test, not just in institutions, but inside our own homes. When we tell people to take care of yourself or do your best, while systematically withholding the structural support they actually need to survive, we're engaging in a form of erasure.
We're erasing the structural limitations and just blaming the individual for their own destruction.
Exactly.
It's easy to feel, helpless after unpacking all of this. It feels so big, so systemic, but we have to land this plane. What does this mean for us? For the person listening to this right now who might be an Elena, or might be an Alex, or might be the sister in the dark?
I think the first step is to stop looking at these stories as just isolated anecdotes about bad families or toxic people. We're looking at a systemic structure, a structure that automatically rewards the payer and automatically punishes the dependent.
And this silent harm is protected by that narrative of the benevolent host. Elena gets to be the hero of her own story because she provided the roof.
Yes, but maybe we need to redefine what adulthood means. Adulthood shouldn't just be about financial independence or paying your own bills. Real adulthood, mature adulthood, should be defined by the capacity to tolerate discomfort without transferring it to those with less power.
Tolerating discomfort without transferring it, that is a heavy definition.
But that is the essence of care, isn't it? If I am stressed, if I'm anxious, I don't make you stop breathing so that I can feel better. I do the internal work. I manage my own stress. I absorb the shock so the vulnerable person doesn't have to.
That's the complete opposite of the minimal self you were talking about. That's an expansive self.
And if I can leave you with one final thought.
Please.
If you are listening to this and you identify with the host, with Elena, with Alex, that is completely natural. You are tired. You are working hard in a brutal economy. But you have to realize this. The independence you prize so highly is incredibly fragile. You are one car accident, one diagnosis, one pink slip, one stroke of bad luck away from being the sister in the dark. The systems of logic you use today, the logic that justifies neglecting the unproductive or the difficult dependent, those are the exact same systems that will be waiting for you when your own productivity inevitably falters.
We are constructing the moral architecture of our own future abandonment.
Every time we nod along with an Elena, that's what we're building.
That is a chilling realization, but maybe we need that chill to wake us up. Thank you for walking us through this. This was a lot.
It's a hard conversation, but I think the most important ones always are.
And thank you for listening to this deep dive. We'll see you next time.